Today we're going to be covering one specific ban list that banned a total of 5 cards in the Pioneer format, a relatively high number in comparison to most ban lists. Specifically, we'll be talking about every card banned on the February 2021 ban list. We'll be starting with 2 cards that did something very similar, Balustrade Spy and Undercity Informer. Balustrade Spy is a 2/3 vampire rogue with a mana cost of 3 and 1 black. It has flying and the ability where, when it enters the battlefield, target player mills cards until they mill a land card. Undercity Informer, likewise, is a 2/3 human rogue with a mana cost of 2 and 1 black. It is the ability where you can pay 1 and sacrifice a creature to mill target player until they mill a land card. Why were Balustrade Spy and Undercity Informer banned? These cards had been in the format for quite a while and hadn't posed any problem. It wasn't until the release of Zendikar Rising that people found a way to abuse them. This set introduced modal dual-phase cards, or MDFCs for short. How MDFCs worked is that you can play either their front half or their back half while they're in your hand. However, while the card is anywhere else, like in your graveyard or in exile, it's only treated as the front half of the card. Essentially, it was 2 cards in 1, like the old split cards. The thing is, being only the front side while in your deck ended up being very abusable with Spy and Informer. The MDFCs from Zendikar Rising were all spells on the front and lands on the back. These proved to be powerful in their own right, making it so that they were much less likely to flood or to not draw enough lands. But the main upside was that they let you play lands without playing any lands. When you drew the cards, you could play the backsides to make mana, but when Spy or Informer were looking through your library, they would be spells and wouldn't stop the milling. This made it possible to play a deck with no lands in it at all, but still cast and activate your Spy or Informer, letting you mill your entire deck with the cards. This led to the emergence of a deck called Oops All Spells in Pioneer, based off of its legacy counterpart. Although milling your whole deck is a bit risky with proper deck building, it's extremely abusable. Most builds played a couple of copies of Worldspine Worms simply because it shoveled itself back into your library whenever it's milled, so when they milled their whole deck, they wouldn't deck out. They also played 4 copies of Creeping Chill and 1 Narcomoeba. Chill is a sorcery with the ability where, when you mill it, you exile it and deal 3 damage to your opponent, then gain 3 life. Narcomoeba is a 1/1 with flying that puts itself into play whenever it's milled. The 4 copies of Chill would deal a grand total of 12 damage to your opponent, not enough to kill them, but it would put them at a paltry 8 life. More importantly, it would also trigger the ability of Silver's Moat Ghoul. This is a 3/1 zombie with the ability where, at the beginning of the end step, if you gain 3 more life this turn, you would return it from graveyard to the battlefield tapped. With 4 copies of this card, you would give yourself 12 power worth of creatures to attack your opponent with next turn. The deck didn't stop there though. It also played a playset of Prize Amalgam, a 3/3 that would reanimate itself at the end step if a creature card entered the field from your graveyard or was cast from your graveyard. This would trigger it off your Narcomoeba, so the turn you milled your deck, you would deal 12 damage to your opponent and put a total of 25 power into play. Then on the next turn, you'd simply attack for lethal. This was also harder to stop than you might think. Even if you played a board wipe on the following turn, the deck could use Haunted Dead to re-trigger all the Prize Amalgams and get their board right back. You would need a very specific out, like Anger of the Gods, to stop them after their combo. The combo was difficult to interact with and was basically just an instant win button, so Wizards banned the card to make the format more approachable. Could Balustrade Spy and Undercity Informer be unbanned? No, this combo would have a harder time competing in the modern day, but it would still be able to carve out a niche in the metagame. The bigger problem is that different versions of these combos would be discovered as more and more cards got printed. Cards that interact with the graveyard appear in basically every set. More cards that are able to abuse this effect will be printed over time. We already have cards like Lot the Giant in the format that could one-shot your opponent after going off with Spy or Informer. There just isn't a good way to get it into play after milling yourself. There's also always Thassa's Oracle, which the deck would sideboard to try and win against decks that actually could answer their board as zombies, or beat people who tried to use the Rest in Peace to stop the combo. Even the current version of the combo could become more problematic with any sort of ways to generate extra mana, as cards like Lotus Petal do in Legacy. These are another pair of cards that will be an issue someday if they aren't today, so they really should stay banned. How could Spy and Informer be fixed to be unbanned? The only real fix would be making it so they actually had to hit a land to mill at all. You could change the wording to be something like, reveal cards from top of target player's library until you reveal a land. If you do, put those cards into their graveyard. Otherwise, shuffle them into their library. This would stop these cards from being used for these combos. You could still play them in a shell like this with only 1 land in your deck and try to mill a lot of cards, but that would be risking a lot of games on hitting enough parts of your combo before that 1 land. Not to mention that the combo stops working if you open that land and don't have a way to put it back into your deck. This might not kill the deck entirely, but it would weaken it enough that they could be unbanned. Next, we have Teferi, Time Raveler. This is a 4 loyalty planeswalker with a mana cost of 1, 1 white, and 1 blue. It is a +1 ability where, until your next turn, you can cast sorcery spells anytime you get cast an instant. It has a -3 where you bounce target artifact, creature, or enchantment, then draw a card. Finally, he has a static ability where your opponent can only cast spells anytime they get cast a sorcery. Why was Teferi the Time Raveler banned? Teferi is a card that dooms your opponent to one of the cruelest fates imaginable, having to play Hearthstone. I do kid to a degree, but forcing your opponent to play at sorcery speed while you can not only still play instants, but can play a ton of extra cards at instant speed thanks to Teferi's +1 is extremely limiting. It's difficult to explain how good Teferi's static is, but it's immediately obvious if you've ever played against the card. Interacting on your opponent's turn is one of the most powerful things you can do in Magic, and Teferi not only stops your opponent from doing so, it makes your interactions completely unstoppable. You get to dictate the entire pace of the game while Teferi is on board. This isn't even getting into the numerous cards that just don't work with Teferi in play. Basically, any effect that casts a spell without paying mana for it doesn't work with Teferi out, as it's technically being cast at instant speed. Counter magic just stops working entirely for your opponent, so you can go for any play you want with complete impunity. This is all without even talking about the final ability, and that one is also really good. The -3 isn't the best removal ever, but it's a big tempo play that draws you a card right away, so if your opponent kills Teferi right away, you aren't that beat up about it. That's the sneaky worst part of Teferi. He can be played on turn 3 to bounce a card and cycle, and if he dies immediately, that's fine. If he doesn't, that is very not fine for the person without Teferi. It's a card that you must answer, but your opponent really isn't beat out of shape about having it answered. All of this explains why the card was so good, but that alone isn't why the card was banned. Teferi wasn't only a bit too good for the format, it was also a very unpopular card. Teferi was extremely good both in Standard and in Modern after its release in 2019's War of the Spark, which had only just rotated out a few months ago at the time of the ban list. The card had been incredibly ubiquitous across multiple formats for the past 2 years, and people were honestly just tired of it. A combination of the card being unpopular and being too good in various decks led to the card getting banned both to weakened decks like Fires of Invention and Nib Mizzet Reborn that were taking advantage of Teferi, and were too prominent at the time to make the format more enjoyable to play for more decks. Now, could Teferi the Time Raveler be unbanned? This is a soft yes. The card is incredibly strong and incredibly annoying, but it wouldn't be broken. It's a lot worse than Oko, the other banned 3-mana planeswalker in Pioneer. Threats like Fable the Mirrorbreaker are around with the same power levels as Teferi. The main reason Teferi is still on the ban list is that Wizards only unbans cards for specific reasons. If they don't think an unban would make the format better, they leave the card banned. They're more than content to let cards that aren't playable, but wouldn't be used for anything fun, rot on the ban list forever. For a great example of this, look at Blazing Shoal in Modern, a pretty weak card by today's standards that is only banned because it would be kind of annoying to play against, despite not being the best way for Infect to work nowadays. It could maybe come off the ban list, but it won't unless Wizards feels like blue-white decks need some extra help. How could Teferi be fixed to be unbanned? The card is probably fine as is. It does have an alchemy version that's slightly nerfed though. This version is a 4-mana planeswalker with 5 loyalty and all the same abilities. This would be a perfect fix and could come back with absolutely no issues with these changes. Of course, it doesn't strictly need these changes to come off the ban list, but again, players really don't like playing against Teferi for obvious reasons. So they'd like it if he were weaker if the card were hypothetically reintroduced into the format. Next up, we have Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. This is a 6/6 legendary Elder Giant with a mana cost of 1, 1 green, and 1 blue. It has the abilities where, when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice Uro unless it escaped. When it enters the field or attacks, you draw a card, then put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Then you gain 3 life. Finally, it has an escape cost of 2 blue, 2 green, and exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. Escape allows you to cast the card from your graveyard for its escape cost. Why was Uro banned? Uro is similar to Oko Thief of Crowns in that it was just far too much value for way too little cost. A good place to start is comparing Uro to his cousin, Kroxa. This is another Titan with a similar set of abilities, dying when it enters the battlefield if you didn't escape it, and giving you an effect when it enters the field or attacks. In Kroxa's case, it forces your opponent to discard a card. Then they lose 3 life if they didn't discard a non-land card. Effectively, this means if they don't discard a card or discard a land, they lose 3 life. Kroxa is a bit of a staple in black-red mid-range decks thanks to being a huge threat that's very difficult to remove. His ability to rip cards out of your opponent's hand is either a good source of card advantage or a source of extra damage. Getting all this essentially for free in the late game is more than worth it to make up for Kroxa not being that great when you actually draw into it. Uro does all of that, but even better. Drawing cards is always good, whereas forcing your opponent to discard is only good while your opponent has cards in hand. Gaining life is always nice, and Uro even ramps you, making casting him for 4 mana from your graveyard even easier. Speaking of making Uro easier to escape, drawing extra cards gives you access to more cards that will eventually go to your graveyard, once again making fulfilling Uro's escape cost even easier. The end result of all these attributes is that Uro is amazing at snowballing into itself. On turn 3, it draws you a card, ramps you, and makes you even more difficult to aggro down. With the extra ramp and card draw, you have an easier time getting Uro out, and every turn your opponent doesn't answer him, you're pulling further and further ahead with its attack trigger. When they finally do answer Uro, if they didn't exile him, he'll likely be coming back next turn anyway. All of this not only made blue-green decks difficult to deal with in the late game, but even shored up their early game because Uro, unlike Kroxa, was a perfectly fine card to cast from your hand just for his enter the field trigger, even if it dies right afterward. Uro supercharged decks in his color, giving blue-green decks a huge leg up on the rest of the competition. Considering how much better Uro was than just about everything else in the format that wasn't some busted combo, Uro was banned to help other decks compete. Now, could Uro be unbanned? This is another no. Uro's power is something you have to see to really understand. The impact it has on the game on turn 3 and the next couple of turns isn't as large as most other threats at the same mana value. However, over the course of the game, Uro has a huge impact. Getting your Uro back several times is essentially impossible for other decks to deal with, not only because it's a huge 6/6 that also has to be dealt with immediately, but because Uro makes all the cards around him even better as well. Uro would still be far too strong. Kroxa is, once again, much weaker than Uro and very playable in the format to this day, showing just how strong this effect is in the format. How could Uro be fixed to be unbanned? Once again, we can use Kroxa as a benchmark. What pushes the card into unfair territory is the strength of its enter the field / attack trigger, so that needs to be nerfed. Making it so that it didn't draw a card anymore would make the card a bit too weak, but taking away the life gain would be too little. The best compromise would be drawing a card and gaining the life, but not getting to ramp a land into play. This would still be very powerful, more powerful than Kroxa, but it would be much easier to play against. And next up, we have Wilderness Reclamation, the last card banned in Pioneer on the February 2021 ban list. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. It is the ability where you untap all lands you control during your end step. Why was Wilderness Reclamation banned? We already talked about this card in the last part of the series we went over Nexus of Fate. So the card was already a big part of a deck problematic enough to need a ban. Reclamation is, by itself, very strong, as being able to have your mana up on your opponent's turn is very good for interactive decks. Blue decks in particular thanks to reliance on counter magic. This is what makes cards like Seedborn Muse powerful, though they never ended up being competitively viable. Though the devil is always in the details, and if you watch the last part of the series, you should remember that the card is especially broken on your own turn. Reclamation untaps your lands at the end of your turn, instead of untapping during your opponent's untap step like other similar effects do. This gives you a brief window of time where you can tap your lands for mana, float the mana, let Reclamation untap your lands, then tap them again. Reclamation isn't a Seedborn Muse effect, it's a mana doubler, and one of the best we've seen in a long time. Doubling your mana is incredibly broken, but it's usually kept in check by requiring you to pay 5 or more mana on a turn without really impacting the board. Reclamation doesn't have this weakness, as it gives your mana back on the turn you play it, making it far easier for control shells to splash the card. Sure, it only doubles your mana for instant speed spells, but that's perfectly fine. Reclamation couldn't be used to take extra turns after Nexus got banned, but luckily it had partners like Expansion Explosion you could pour your mana into. This is a split card, but the half that matters most here is Explosion. This instant costs X to red and 2 blue, lets you draw X cards and deal X damage to any target. This would normally be far too much mana for a card to see play. To draw 2 cards off the effect, you'd have to pay a massive 6 mana. However, if you were making 10 or more mana during your end step and needed an instant to spend it on, Explosion was almost always your best bet. With 1 Reclamation and only 5 or so lands, you could be casting Explosion for 6 or more, killing any threat in play and drawing a full new hand of cards. And that's only with 1 Reclamation in play. If you had several, you could perform this trick multiple times to triple, quadruple, or even quintuple your mana. A lot of games ended by the Reclamation player making 20 plus mana and exploding their opponent for 20 more damage and drawing half their deck at the same time. This is the most dramatic thing that Reclamation did, but it was good in tons of different blue-green control shells. Sultai, or green-blue-black, control also played the card and would use multiples to cast extra draw spells or cycle their Shark Typhoons for a massive amount. All this combined made Reclamation control decks incredibly difficult to stop. They never went shields down, so it was hard to commit to the board, and it was almost impossible to run them out of resources because they turned all that extra mana into even more card advantage with their draw spells. The only thing really keeping these decks in check was the fact that Teferi the Time Raveler completely shut them down. But with that card being banned in this very ban list, Wizards thought that Reclamation would find a way to break the format very quickly. Out of an abundance of caution, they banned the card before it could become a huge issue. Now, could Wilderness Reclamation be unbanned? This is sort of a yes. The format has largely caught up to the power of Reclamation decks, but it's still a very difficult card to interact with. Reclamation doesn't have a clear home in any of the current best decks in Pioneer, but players would likely find new ways to build around it. It's difficult to say exactly how good these shells would be, but the old shells it did see play in aren't anything special nowadays. The biggest issue with the card is that it's a very unhealthy play pattern when the card is good, as it removes the biggest form of counterplay against control decks. Since they never have to tap out with Reclamation around, you never get a chance to press the advantage. Reclamation is the kind of card that's either not good enough to see play, or very toxic. So while it's likely weak enough to come back, it should realistically just stay banned. Now, how could Wilderness Reclamation be fixed to be unbanned? A very simple fix is making it so that it lets you untap your lands during your opponent's untap step, not your end step. The floating mana trick is the biggest thing this card has going for it. Without it, it's not really that scary. Some decks might pick it up, as it's easier to play and harder to remove than Prophet of Kruphix, the next best option for this effect in the format. But without the payoff of scamming out memory deluges and explosions, the card's just not all that threatening.